My name is Chotilal. Yeah, so I am a member at the TheDaak. This is our group. So we welcome you all on behalf of the TheDaak to our 29th meeting, Baithak. The TheDaak began in 2023 as a book review journal, publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the start, we sought to reimagine the form of the book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage deeply, reflectively, and creatively with the world a book opens up. Over time, we grew into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explores the intersections across social sciences. Our double blind peer review process ensure rigorous, while our editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, the Dark has grown into a vibrant collective. Through our reading groups, we meet every month to discuss or share books, discovering new perspective through conversation. Through the Dark Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflection, and explainer that extend our conversation into the present moment. The Dark Bathak is our humble attempt to huddle around a small gathering of scholars, writers, students from different fields in India and abroad to present ideas and initiate dialogues, bringing critical conversation to the life. So our session title for today is Outcast Bombay, Urban Transformation and Street-Based Sex Work in Bombay or Mumbai. So today's our esteemed speaker is Sara Bardhan. She is an urban sociologist whose research revolves around the questions of cities, spatial justice, embodiment, social reproduction, and world building using qualitative method rooted in progressive praxis. She is particularly interested in interrogating the unique ways in which we make sense of the city and the embodied, emplaced, and experiential practices of the urban working class habitus. She is currently an assistant professor of sociology at Somaya Vidya Vihar, Mumbai. So now, I our discussant is Swapnil Sreemani. He is a postgraduate student at IIT Delhi. So he will be our discussant. So before starting this session, I want to just lay out the format for our today's talk. So the speaker will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then followed by our discussant that will come in for around 8 to 10 minutes. Then we will open the floor for questions and kind of conversation like questions. So with this, I want to hand over to the our esteemed speaker for the today's talk. Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the work that you're doing at Dark in making dialogue, making it possible to have social sciences and humanities made accessible to a large group of people, I think that's a really wonderful thing that you're doing. So thank you for having me. And I see some familiar names, so I'm glad to see them here. And for all the ones who are unfamiliar with me, I think that was a very well put together introduction. But I teach sociology. I'm an urban sociologist. I'm specifically interested in sex work. This is what my master's thesis was also about. This is what I also am continuing to do. And without much fluff, I think a couple of things before I get into it is I don't use a PPT. I'm not a big PPT fan. So I really want all of you to please pay attention to the story that I'm trying to tell here, because ultimately it's a story, and parts of the story are violent. Sometimes they are heartwarming, sometimes they are scary, but I think it's important to stick with it. And I won't be censoring myself because I think it's important to be honest in the way, in telling you what I've seen on the field and what I do, why I do what I do, essentially. And one more thing before I, start talking is I use Bombay and Mumbai very specifically because we're talking about the entire history of how sex work has happened in the city. right? And Bombay is not only just a name, but it also signifies certain values, a certain political economy, a certain cultural milieu of the city. And Mumbai signifies something very different. It signifies the neoliberal city, it signifies the world class city, the financial capital, and so on and so forth. So the culture and the sociality of the city is also very different. So I think that is why I use Bombay and Mumbai distinctly in here. And also the same with prostitution and sex work. So when I talk about the sex worker in the contemporary moment, I use the term sex work or sex worker. But then if I'm talking about the sex worker in, say, colonial times, I'm talking about her as a prostitute because that's the term that was used. So it's historically consistent. So with that, I think that's enough of a prologue, but epilogue. But what I want to say is, if you've ever been to Bombay, right, or if you're from Bombay, you know that it's a very spatially restricted city. So it's a lot of people all jostled together in very little space. And this is what Ashwini Tambe mentions in her wonderful book, Codes of Misconduct, where she writes that the poor and the rich always brush shoulders with each other. And the historian Rajnarayan Chandavarkar then concludes that because it's such a spatially restricted city, that the segregation, the racial segregation, which was very characteristic of the colonial empire, was not as significantly pronounced in Bombay as it was in, say, other cities. Now, it doesn't mean that racial segregation didn't exist at all or that it was completely imagined. It did exist, and there was something called the White Town, which is now Kolaba, Fort, and all these areas in the southern tip of Bombay, and all the other migrants, all the other troublesome groups, as Rajnaran Chandavarkar puts it, were corralled together outside of this White Town, which is the periphery. So Kamathipura today, where it's located today, is at the center of Bombay city. It's a very important center, and it becomes important because then it also becomes a hub of real estate, right? So back then it wasn't. Back then it was at the periphery, and that made sense. And how Bombay's entanglement with sexual commerce began is also because it's a very important industrial powerhouse and a commercial city. It's a commercial port city at the time. And as it grew more and more important in the global economy as a colonial port city, the British government realized that it needed spaces for recreation for its officers. And while brothels and sexual commerce were absolutely banned in England itself, they tolerated it in their colonies in Asia and Africa, right? Because their officers needed recreation. And because they needed recreation, what they did was, instead of just letting it grow organically, they made it very systematic. They had a proper chief medical officer who would sit at the dock, and there were these European women. They were Croatian, they were Ukrainian, they were Russian, they were Polish, they were Austrian. All of these European women would be invited to come over here to work as prostitutes. They would come, they would get medically tested, they would get registered. And this is important because medicine, and if you're familiar with Foucault, you would know that medicine has always been an institution that disciplines and punishes the sex working body, right? And so that's why I mention it here. And the chief medical officer would then come and do the registration and do all the chores. And then, because they were all European women, and where would they settle? They settled at the periphery. And where at the periphery? At the place where Kamathi migrants from the Hyderabad province had settled. And because they were migrants and they were also from a particular caste location, that particular place became more affordable to erect brothels. And that's why we see all these European women are being settled in Kamathipura. The name Kamathipura comes from Kamathis. And because there were so many European women, that place came to be known as Safed Gali. But it's not that only European women were working as prostitutes in the era, because what's funny is that a lot of European women did not serve Indian working class men. They only serviced the British officials, right? And there was this incident that Ashwini Tambe talks about, where a lot of Indian men, including Parsi men, who were supposed to, who usually belong to an upper echelon of society, they protested, and they said that these disgraceful women do not belong in our neighborhood, and they must be, they must be removed from here. And because they were not that they thought they were disgraceful, yes, of course, it hurt their sentiments somewhere. But what hurt them more was the fact that they wouldn't service them. which meant that there were also Indian prostitutes who were coming into the business, but they didn't work in Safed Gully. They worked in the more working class neighborhoods of the city, like Umbarkhari, Fanaswari, Girgaon, all of these places, right? And they were not as mercilessly regulated as the European prostitute was. But I want to make myself very clear here that the European prostitute, or any prostitute for that matter, is not just a victim. It's not that because they were regulated or because they were tested and because they were, very often the police would detain them, the police would forcibly make them go through medical testing. It's not that they were complete victims, because there are many such incidents where if you've seen that the prostitutes, what they would do is they would forge certificates, they would forge petitions, they would hide their friends and sisters who are unregistered prostitutes. They would pretend that they are married. So they had their own ways. They also bribed policemen, which is something that we see even in the contemporary moment, right? So we see all of that happening even then. So there were what Foucault calls the technologies of self, right? Where you use your own methods to sort of navigate the political climate, right? And that's what we see here. So that is colonial Bombay. And in colonial Bombay, we also see the colonial tools of governmentality, the CDAs, the Contagious Diseases Acts, come in the 1880s. Now they're really expensive. Because you think about it, any policy, if you want to enact, it's really expensive to enact a policy because it's an entire, constituency that they're enforcing it on. You need law hospitals, you need doctors, you need more officers, you need more lawyers, you need a ton of personnel to do this. So ultimately, of course, they were scrapped because it was too expensive for the municipality to do anything like that. But they were enacted, and they were enacted even in Africa, and they were enacted even in the UK. But the way that they were enacted in Africa and in Asia were they were far more strict, and they were far more they criminalized the sex workers far more, right? And we see here that we see a connection that is starting to form here, because even now when we think of sex workers, or even for instance in the 1990s, when we thought of sex workers, we automatically thought of HIV/AIDS, and that's a specter. And that's why we had the NACO, the National AIDS Corporation, and we also had we had so many NGOs come in, we had World Bank funding and so on and so forth. So back then the connection was not AIDS, back then the connection was syphilis. And so it was very important to get them tested medically, and it was very important to make sure that we are safe, because these are potentially troublesome groups, and these are bodies that are they, in a very Foucauldian sense of the way, they are disciplined through medicine. Now, if that's clear, what we see next is the move to post-colonial Bombay. And in post-colonial Bombay, what we see is that feminists who were trying at this moment very hard to establish themselves as legitimate partner in the nationalist movement. And in doing so, what they had to do, they had to cast themselves as anti-Western, right? Because if you're Western in any sort of way, then you can't be a legitimate partner in the nationalist movement. The Congress won't accept you. So what they were doing, or what they were forced to do, is that, or the choice that they made was to not support the sex workers at all here, unfortunately, right? And unfortunately, what this led to is a new formation of a different kind of morality, a post-colonial Hindu morality. And we know that in the earlier examples of the CDAs or the Colonial Diseases Act, for instance, what we are seeing is a Victorian morality. And if you're familiar with the Victorian era, you know how a woman is cast and how a woman is supposed to be. And while in the post-colonial city of Bombay, we were trying to break off that connection with Victorian morality. We were trying to establish something that is purely Indian. Correct. So in establishing something that's purely Indian, what we ended up doing is we ended up continuing the same morality. So it wasn't Victorian morality anymore, but it was something known as the Hindutva morality. So in here, we see that the woman's body is cast as something that is supposed to be chaste, something pious, something clean, something untainted by colonial intervention, something that is supposed to be obedient and patient and self-sacrificing. And in doing this, the woman's body became it became a site of nation building in itself. It became the national body, and to the extent that an organization such as the RSS, even they, in their official mouthpiece, the organizer, go on to say that it's these condom manufacturers, it's these NGOs that have come in after World Bank funding, and it's these all these organizations that are starting to pop up, the CBOs and all. They are the ones who are trying to give India a bad name, who are trying to cast our women as promiscuous sinners. And it's nothing like that, because they couldn't accept the fact that there is sexual activity, there is intimacy, there is sex work, and there are Indians who indulge in all of this, and there are Indian women who are forced to work as sex workers. So this is what we see in post-colonial Bombay, but in the post-colony also, we see that this is a very tumultuous time. This is a time where we are in flux because there is nation building that's happening, right? So that we've discussed. Then we also see that sometime later, this becomes a time where there is a lot of communal activity that's happening. We eventually see the demolition of the Babri, which then leads to the 92-93 riots in Bombay. And then we see a lot of sex workers who service the working class men, who a lot of them were Muslim. They were driven away to the peripheries. In Mumbai, for instance, which is far away from Bombay. It's outside of the periphery of Bombay. It's somewhere in Thane. And then what we see is that the clientele is changing. The clientele is changing. The political climate is changing. The rules are changing. And now the sex worker is dazed. Because what is it that we do now? Because people can't afford to pay for sex work anymore. Right? So it's a time where everything is in flux. And then in the 90s, we see the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We see the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which means, again, the World Bank funding, the NGOs. And I want to reiterate this anecdote where one of my facilitators, she was saying that when she was in the 90s, and the NGO had come in with condoms to her, and she had made a balloon out of the condom with water, and she threw it at the social workers. And she said that, please don't come into our neighborhood and teach us what to do and what not to do. And these are anecdotes that they remember. And now if you talk to a sex worker, some of them tell me that they use 2-3 condoms because they're so afraid of HIV, and they're so afraid of pregnancy, and they're very careful of STDs, right? So this is something that the trajectory of Kamatipura that we see. But one more thing is that Kamatipura, even when it wasn't a hub of sex work or a red light area, even when it wasn't such, there were something called Kundu, what Kundu and Satija talk about. They say that there is something called a loose proletarian economy there. So which means everything that we consider to have a loose moral order. So gambling, pawn shops, right, drinking, bars, all of these activities also existed in Kamatipura. So that is why we see that the entire neighborhood itself was branded as having a loose moral order. And Kundu and Satija also interestingly talk about how there were many redevelopment plans that the BMC had planned for Kamatipura, but they never ended up doing anything about it. Even Morarji Desai, the famous politician, he had said that don't touch Kamatipura, let it be as it is. So it almost became the site of the homo sacer. And homo sacer means the person who's out of ordinary, who's not normal, in very simple words, that is. So this homo sacer and this loose moral order became characteristic of Kamatipura. So if now the context is clear, we can move forward to seeing how policing, how NGOs, and how medicine, they become very important institutions that discipline and punish sex workers. So when I went to Kamatipura, one of my facilitators told me, this is a slightly, I would say, I would probably give a trigger warning, but I want you to hear it. But it's a slightly violent story. But one of my facilitators, she told me the story of a young sex worker called Sparkle. Names are anonymized. And Sparkle had fallen in love with a client, right? And the client had also fallen in love with her. They wanted to elope, they wanted to get away, they wanted to have a happy married life outside of Kamatipura. But what happened then is that there was this another client who had fallen in love with Sparkle. But he got to know later that she doesn't love him back. She loves someone else. So, out of rage, he goes and after they are done with their appointment, he takes a piece of blade and he slits it through her vagina. And then he leaves. And Sparkle is obviously horrified. She's screaming, she's crying. The gharwali or the pimp, she comes upstairs to check what's happening. She doesn't want to take any responsibility. So Sparkle calls a lady from an NGO that she knows, and then they take her to the nearest hospital, which is JJ Hospital. If you're familiar with the circuit in Bombay, you'll know that. But yeah, so JJ Hospital, and because there's so much howling and so much crying, they are pushed to the front of the line. But when the receptionist asks where they're from and they say Kamatipura, the receptionist says, we can't take an emergency case right now, there's a lot of people here. So she's pushed to the back of the line again, and because the bleeding won't stop, they have taken a piece of pillow cover. They've taken a pillow cover and they've pursed it between her thighs so that she doesn't bleed more than necessary. And because there's so much howling and so much noise, the police comes eventually, and the police asks what's happening. Why is there so much hoo-ha about this? And so they are explained, what's happened, and then the police says ki, and this is slightly, I mean, this is really at the crux of the entire thesis, that जब काम करते टाइम मजा आता है तो अब सजा भुगतो. So when you have fun while working, now you deserve this. It's essentially for people who don't understand Hindi. And when this happened, and they eventually did not get any treatment at all at the government hospital. They had to go to a nearby private dispensary and pay 21,000 rupees to get stitches done, which they could have done for free at the government hospital or for a very nominal cost. And this really goes to show that not just these very violent incidences, but even a small cough and cold, when you go to the dispensary as a sex worker and you're asked where you're from and you say Kamatipura, you're immediately looked at in a very different way. So which translates into a poorer quality of care that you receive. So this has very material implications on a sex worker's life. And there's this concept called chronic waiting that a lot of scholars have talked about. And I bring this concept in with the concept of Bombay, the necropolitics, and where he talks about disposable citizens who are not really required by the state, who are not looked at in the same way by the state. And these citizens then are condemned to wait forever in these hospital lines, in these dispensary lines, in these insurance lines, because they do not receive the quality of care that maybe you and I deserve, or you and I receive for that matter, right? So Foucault, again, if you're familiar with Foucault at all, and even if you're not familiar with Foucault, Foucault talks about how there are disciplinary diagrams, and the hospital, the dispensary, the doctor, they also become sources of disciplining a sex worker's body, because you're being told that this is a very noble thing, that I'm giving you medication, I'm testing you for HIV, I'm testing you for syphilis, I'm testing you for COVID, I'm telling you to use a condom, I'm telling you to do this, I'm telling you to do that. But if it's forced upon you, right, that's where you can't negotiate that for a longer period of time. And we see that. Then there's another, because if you're interested in this at all, you can ask me a question after this, but I want to continue to the next institution. And Foucault again talks about something called sub-policing. So sub-policing means that there is an institution of the police, yes, but there are also other actors who regulate your behavior. Okay. And the other actors, I want to give you an example here again, is that, like I had said in the previous example, that a lot of sex workers also give bribes so that they have a safe position in the neighborhood, so that the police doesn't come and harass them, or if somebody else is harassing them, the police saves them from that. So when that is happening, they also give bribes. So there was this one sex worker who had left the work, so she no longer felt the need to give any bribes, or she no longer felt the need to, you know, treat the police or service the police in any sort of way. So the one so one constable comes and then says, "Ki hey, where is our hafta for Diwali? Because it's a festival, so you must give us some extra money." And she says, "I am not working anymore. I don't think I need to give you anything because I don't need any saving anymore, right? And either do I need to please you to save me from the police or some from other people who are offenders and harassers, etc." So the police says, "Well, if you don't want to pay me, then come downstairs and at least niche mere saab hai, niche my senior is here. You come and meet him." And in doing that, what they do is detain her. They detain her, they take her, and she has HIV. So she needs medication regularly. They don't give her any medication when she's detained. And then they call the person that used to pimp her, her gharwali, and tell them that, "Hey, listen, we have your sex worker, we have your girl. You must come and pay for her bail." So the gharwali comes and says, "Are they've caught you again. So what do you want me to do? Do you want me to pay for you, or do you want to rot?" And obviously, the sex worker says, "Please let me go. I need to take my medication. I have a family. I have children. I can't stay here. I need to earn money. I need to put my child to school." So the gharwali says, "Well, they're asking for 3-4 lakhs. How do I pay that?" This, of course, there was no other option. So the gharwali says that, "Listen, I'll pay for now. But then whatever, you have to work again. And whatever you earn, I will take that." So that's how a lot of sex workers also find themselves in the cycle, in this vicious cycle, right? And what's interesting is that it's not only the gharwali and the police that are hands in glove, but it's also the police, the constables, it's the lawyers. Because the lawyer comes and he knows exactly from which kholi, from which street, which girl, which pimp's employee has been taken away. So he comes and quotes his price accordingly. So they call this, I mean, my respondents use this word very specifically. They use the word nexus. They say it's a nexus. They have some mandavli between each other. There is some arrangement that they've made, which is the Marathi word for, the English word for the Marathi word mandavli. And some arrangement they have, some nexus that they have, and that's how they run. Nobody's on our side. So we see how even the gharwali becomes a part of the sub-policing diagram. It's not just the police. But at the same time, or maybe I'll address this later, again, the NGOs, right? Again, a very important institution in Kamatipura and in all sex working neighborhoods, because they have some major funding and they have been doing partly some wonderful work in making grains, in making education, in making healthcare, in making jobs accessible to the sex workers. And the sex workers, they are very fond of the NGOs because they think that the NGOs are doing wonderful work, like I said, offering them all these resources. But at the same time, we must think critically of these NGOs itself, because what they are trying to do is they are also somewhere trying to, their existence itself withers away the state's responsibility. So civil society becomes the most important entity in saving sex workers, while the government sort of washes off all the responsibility. So the state has withered, but the civil society has stayed. And civil society has assumed the figure of a pseudo state, almost like a satellite state in Kamatipura, in Falkland Road, in these circuits, which is very interesting to see, because that's not a sustainable model at all. And that is not a model, a democratic model, if you think about it. It's a very libertarian model of how one must be, or how civil society must work. And there's something to think about there as well. And but at the same time, I just want to bring the last 2 points that I want to address here, is that there is a very big difference between the brothel based sex worker and the street based sex worker. The brothel based sex worker is usually from Hyderabad, from Telangana, from Nepal, and she has a quota of her own, yeah, that she rents, that she's leased from a gharwali, and that is where she does her work. But the street based sex worker, she is someone who finds work on the street. And oftentimes the street based sex worker is Bengali in Kamatipura. And when I went there, I am Bengali, I did not tell them that I'm Bengali, because there is a lot of resistance towards Bengali sex workers, because the other sex workers think these Bengalis have come and taken away all our jobs. And when they asked me, where are you from? I said, I'm from Bombay. And because I don't have an accent, so it wasn't that obvious that I'm Bengali, because or else they would have been resistant to telling me these stories. And what's interesting here is that they think the Bengalis here have a loose morality, because a lot of the older sex workers from Telangana and from Nepal, they have been trafficked. But a lot of these Bengali sex workers have come on their own, and they've been pimped by their husbands. They live with their families. So they think that this is not, they are of loose character. And it's very interesting to see these dynamics out there. And finally, before ending, I picked the most important things, of course, but if you ask me questions, I can elaborate. But finally, I think the most important thing here is that we must not see sex workers as victims. They are not victims, and they've also, there are many such ways how they are negotiating the cards that they are dealt with, right? And so because of redevelopment, because of so much gentrification, because of the real estate and the land mafia in Bombay, where now we are seeing all these neighborhoods. That Kamatipura was once in the periphery, but now it's in the center. So obviously, it's a very big, very, very lucrative place. So, which means a lot of builders are coming in. There's a lot of FSI that's being given out, and a lot of redevelopment, gentrification activities. The gharwalis, the pimps, they think it's much more lucrative to give their plot of land to a builder than to house sex workers. So, the number of sex workers have dwindled big time. And also, we see that, in the very beginning, I had said that these neighborhoods became places to corral troublesome groups together, so that they don't leak in other places of the city. They don't spread out. We all have them in one place. All the migrants, all the sex workers, all the troublesome groups. But because of redevelopment and gentrification, we now find sex workers everywhere in the city. And Gayatri Jayaraman from the Mint, and if I'm not wrong, Munjiba Bhattacharya from Intimate City, they talk about how there is this incidence of, if you go to the McDonald's outside the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus CSMT, you will find that somebody is standing with a catalogue of women. You go, you choose which woman you want, and then you pay the amount, whether it's in advance or in full, and then you go find a hotel, or you go take her to your place, or you go find some cheap accommodation where you can go for your appointment. So now sex workers are everywhere. They are no longer just in Kamatipura. They are in Borivali. They are in Bandra. They are in Vileparle. They are in Mumbai. They are in Thane. They are in Gudbandar Road. They are everywhere. And that really defeats the entire logic of making a place the constitutive outside. Because even though if you go to Kamatipura today, and I often do, there aren't as many sex workers as you see. And there are only a few sex workers that you see in particular lanes of Kamatipura. The others are just, small scale industries, cottage industries, markets, all of that. So even though that, there are not as many sex workers anymore, what has happened here is that the characteristic of loose morality and the loose moral order has still stuck with the neighborhood. That hasn't gone away. again, so coming back to the fact that sex workers are not all victims, what's important here that sex workers also know how to negotiate these circumstances, right? And the police, even though we saw the example where they take hafta or they detain you, they are hands in glove with the government and they're hands in glove with the what do I say? The hands in glove with the gharwali. But we also have to see the police as a very fluid entity because they're taking the haftas, which is essentially protection money in English, right? So they're taking the protection money to protect you against people who are going to harass you. There's a place called Congress House, which used to be a place for nautch girls and classical dancers back in previous few decades. And we see a line of these nautch girls walking into Congress House late at night, and then the police are there to protect them. They are sort of barricading the girls so that no random passerby comes and catcalls them or is violent with them or harasses them. So it's not that anybody is an ideal victim or an ideal villain. They are all in grays. That is what we have to negotiate here. And the sex workers, and it's not that power is always top down. Power is distributed, it's networked, it's relational. So, which is what we have to keep in mind because, the last example here, but sex workers, when they are caught by the police, they are sent to a place called Navjeevan in they're sent for Navjeevan. It's a district legal society, and they are put in there. And one of my respondents who did some field work at Navjeevan tells me that the places that they live in Navjeevan, they are called barracks. So which automatically assumes a very carceral sort of personality, and they're called barracks. And in these barracks, women are made to wear similar clothes. They have no connection with the outside world. They can't use the phone. They can't eat different food. And the sex workers report feeling very small and they report feeling very lonely. And after that, when they go to the court, they are asked whether you want to stay in Navjeevan and have a new life, which is exactly what Navjeevan means, or do you want to go back? And 98% of all sex workers want to go back because nobody wants to live in Navjeevan. Nobody wants to feel like a prisoner. So the state's rehabilitative, or it's supposed to be a rehabilitative space, is not rehabilitative at all. In fact, it's carceral. So for a sex worker, moving out of there is a form of autonomy, and finding something to do of her own is a form of autonomy. And I want to highlight here that despite being so many NGOs that work for sex workers, the most important work that I have found being done is by sex workers themselves for themselves. So autonomous sex workers collectives, they have been doing some wonderful work here. And I think with that, I'll stop. I don't want to bore you further. But if you have any questions at all, I'd be happy to answer.
Uh, I think we are very blessed that every time, whenever we organize talk, we are kind of given a lots of field details. Usually in academic conversation, it is very rare, and we are very fortunate and lucky that you gave lots of details and several anecdotes from the field. So thank you so much. I want to invite to the our discussant Swapnil to take the platform and give his thought on this conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hi Sara. Uh, I would first of all like to congratulate you on the talk. I think it's quite expansive, and in my case, it brought forth a lot of ideas that I want to talk about. But due to the paucity of time, I think it would be better if I focus on some of the main questions and contestations I have. And I hope like the contestations are taken in the spirit of academia itself so we can sort of mutually overcome structural misrecognition. The first contestation I have is how would you sort of respond to the charge that in your historiography of colonial and post-colonial times leading to the neoliberal sort of Mumbai and the Bombay-Mumbai distinction, how would you say, like, respond to the charge that there is not a sort of historical flattening happening, in the sense that the paper sort of doesn't talk about caste very centrally. And why do I talk about caste? Because it's a socio-ontological category. It's not just an intersection. And I would like for you to respond to something, like some thoughts I have in that regard. Uh, One of which is I really enjoyed how you sort of first articulated it through a Foucauldian discourse. But the sort of problem I thought is that since Foucault locates power in discourses, I thought the paper sort of articulated the sort of class power structure really nicely, but the caste power structure was missing. And what that resulted in, and I quote from your paper, is that there was a sort of antinomy. What I mean by that is the paper talks about the impossibility of collectivization, and that is sort of chalked up to the sub-police structures, but also the post-structural conceptualization of power, which helps us locate agency. But what does that agency mean? Aside from moralizing sex work, if it does not help us dismantle the structures which produce caste work, because like while sorry, not caste work, sex work, because what I mean is that sex work itself isn't moral, but the problem is it's entrenched in structures which produce uh, injustices and endangers the sex worker. So what I want to say is that one of the sort of historical flattenings I want to point to is that in colonial times, sex sort of prostitution already existed in form of caste groups, and one such law I could locate is the Criminal Tribes Law that was enacted in 1871, which sort of formalized entire communities based on the work they did, which was essentially prostitution. So, if we do not talk about that, how can we sort of begin to even posit the idea that sex work is work in the sense that you have the freedom to choose to do it or not? Hello, you are muted,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah. Thank you, Swapnil. I think our speaker can respond to your comments here.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were very important provocations. And I think I want to speak to the point of caste first and foremost.
Right,
Is that the thing is that, of course, we know the entire, the structure that you brought up, and caste is essential to thinking
hmm,
about sex work in in India or in the subcontinent in general. But because so much of my specific work or this paper, where it has emanated from, is only based in about a year of field work.
right,
So I feel like to talk about caste, it requires much more engagement on the field, and
right. Yeah, fair
requires
enough.
far more, yeah, and it requires um, far more work that is being done on caste and sex work, specifically with autonomous sex working groups.
Mm-hmm.
And why I say that collectivization is difficult, and again, to speak of agency here,
Yeah.
is that collectivization is specifically difficult in the city of Bombay and Mumbai. That's because, like I said earlier, there is this entire nexus that they point to, right? Where somewhere the government and its rehabilitative schemes, the police with its aids, raids, trades sort of approach, raid and rescue approach, and then we have, of course, the sub-policing infrastructure. Then we have the gharwalis. Then we have you and I controlling morality of what a city should look like, or what a city should feel like. All of this makes it very difficult for collectivization to exist in Bombay, specifically because it's a neoliberal capitalist city, and specifically because there exists so much focus on land. I began the talk with talking about how Bombay is a spatially restricted city. So every space here is very important. Every space is lucrative, and that
Right,
somehow supersedes the ability of collectivization here. And that is what Tejasvi Sevekari of the National Network of Sex Workers also told me, because they have been able to form autonomous sex working collectivizations, a collectivization in Sangli or in Nagpur, and we have the VAMP as well, and we have the NNSW that works in Pune as well in the different PATs, but we don't have anything like that in Bombay. And
Right.
it's very rare to find sex working collectives. Recently, I visited the Kamatipura Kala Mela, which is
Right.
again about it's an organization, but it's sort of co-producing art through with sex workers. So we find these instances of co-production, but very few instances of autonomous production, which then again speaks to the inability to collectivize, at least immediately. And of course, caste is a very big blind spot, because again, like I said, requires a long-term engagement on it.
Yeah.
So that
I
is,
mean, yeah.
yeah, go on.
Yeah, just I mean that I think like that sort of differential treatment of what your paper is doing and caste cannot be sort of exclusive of each other. I think to sort of better conceptualize sex work in itself, because I was looking at papers that sort of talk about the problems of unionization of caste of sex workers, and caste continues to be a sort of big
Yes.
problem in that regard. So because it's a division of, let's remind ourselves, it's a division of laborers and not of labor. I think even I don't have any issues with the frameworks being used to sort of think about moving beyond these structures, but I think it sort of needs to be informed by a caste analysis, if you would agree.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And also, I think what I was trying to do here is also emplace the notions that I'm talking about. So,
Mm.
because I'm an urban sociologist, so my
Right.
was a lot on the space itself. So, which is why in the longer paper, I also talk in detail about how Kamatipura and Falkland Road are distinct spaces and
Yeah.
the historiography of the spaces itself. And
Yeah.
so speaking of historiography, I think, of course, there is, of course, when we try to arrange anything in a pattern, there is a certain amount of flattening that we do, but it also
Yeah.
makes it. And this is not to say that there are no nuances in the colonial time, or it was all just the same. And the the post-colonial Bombay, the scene of post-colonial Bombay was all just the same. It's not that there is no
Mm.
sameness, but of course there is a flattening that we do, and there is something to be said to the effect of how it allows us to then use them as categories
Mm.
to analyze. But then there is something. I think what could be interesting here is that how there are other scholars like Kashmir Tambe, like
Right.
Swati P. Shah, who has done some wonderful work. They specifically focus on one of these epochs.
Mm.
So when they focus on one of these epochs, they're able to not lend themselves to that sort of
Mm-hmm.
flattening per se. And because what I'm trying to do is, at least in this paper, trying
Mm-hmm.
to trace the entire historiography of the place and the space, that is where I think it becomes difficult to not then lend yourself to this sort of flattening.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's enough for that question. I also found it really interesting how you dealt with the sort of concepts that are implicit in social practices. What do you think changed, if you could bring it forth more explicitly, what do you think changed from the colonial conception of what is regarded as public and private space to the sort of post-colonial to now the sort of Indian conception of public and private space? So to the fact that, as you pointed out, in England, like sex work was not tolerated at all, and in sort of India, the sex work was tolerated, and now with the presence of street-based sex workers, there is an understanding that these workers can sort of survive on the street itself. Like they're still being afforded space. They're putting this sort of public space within India to a private use, right? So what is that conceptual change, if you could point out?
I think that's a very interesting question because the street in the contemporary times then becomes a scale of sexual geography, which was
Right.
foreseen before. And that is also, I mean, also because of the regimes of redevelopment and gentrification and the paucity of space and the entire, the specter of land mafia. There's this wonderful book called Corruption. um I'm so sorry. It's by Malini Ranganathan, and she talks about the specter of corruption. Along with,
Mm-hmm.
there are two other authors that they talk about. So there's this wonderful book that talks about the land mafia in great detail. I think if anyone is interested, they should definitely go through that. But yeah, so there's something to be said to that. But then I think what is interesting is that in the post-colonial city, where the woman's body becomes the national body, at the same time, the Sangh and more generally the upper class Hindu morality, uh, it dictated that the home was the only place that is untainted by colonial intervention.
Yeah.
So the
Right.
home, and who runs the home? The woman. She becomes a body of, she becomes a site of nation building. So there is a very interesting influx of, the notions of publicness and privateness. There's
Yeah.
coming into play here. And even in colonial times, even though it seems like, prostitution was not allowed in England, it was banned. Of course, that doesn't mean it didn't exist there. It was just legally banned,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was tolerated in Asia and Africa. But even here, you see that the European prostitutes, they were regularly checked, they were registered, and
Mm-hmm.
they were also, when they were caught having syphilis, for instance, they were
Mm-hmm.
put in lock hospitals. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a sense of privateness there as well, where there is an
Mm.
entire gully, the Safed Gully, that is made, that is manufactured for the European prostitutes, whereas the Indian prostitutes, who often belong to dispossessed caste locations,
Mm.
they are not regulated as much because they service the Indian working class. So there is and we often see how Dalit women have more mobility in the way that they,
Yeah.
negotiate the world, right? So that sense of privateness and publicness is also something that we see here. And
Right.
uh, when I talk to sex workers now, a lot of my respondents, they often talk about they often talk about how they don't want to let the brothel go because
Yeah.
that's all they have known. But
Yeah.
it's for them, like I mentioned, the Bengali sex worker who has a loose character, she doesn't
Mm.
deserve to be in the brothel. She deserves to be on the streets
Right.
because, according to them, it's easier to be on the streets anyway because you see the police coming, you run away. We are in the brothel.
Right.
We can't
Right.
run away. So they are
Yeah.
not only of loose character, but they are also cowards. These are words
Right.
that are being used here. So there is something to be said about character, space, publicness, and privateness that I think requires a little bit more thinking. But that's a very interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this will be my last question. But I was also thinking about how sex work slash prostitution is not the only profession which has this sort of lack of space distinction. But it is certainly a more extreme example of that in the sense that due to the materiality of the sex worker's body within these systems, especially like these systems which are fraught with violence, the sex worker is rendered more vulnerable. So, how do you think that conflation of or the lack of, like, say, space where you go and work and like a separate home, which sort of secures you, like a place of work and a home? How do you think that this? How do you think and what do you think happens when that distinction collapses in the sex worker, in the brothel, the space where they work as well as they live, but also their body, which especially for say the street-based sex worker, their home becomes their body. Like that's sort of the last line of defense. So what do you think happens in that?
I think what I'm reminded of is this anecdote from one of my respondents where she says that there was this one sex worker who was a street-based sex worker. So, and then she had also been caught to have HIV. So, and she
Right.
was also a little bit older. right? So
Right.
she didn't have a place to stay because nobody would rent anything to her. And so she
Right.
stayed on the street. And like you were saying, her home became her body, and
Yeah.
vice versa. And she would stay on the street and she would beg for food, she would beg for money. But because no client would also come to her now that she has a bimari, and
Mm-hmm.
because she's also a little bit older, so people would come. My client, as in my respondent, she would come and she would feed her milk and bread as if she were a dog. And
Right.
this one time she had to go away to Pune for a couple of days, so she thought, well, I'll come back and then feed her. She went and then she saw that she'd passed away, and
Mm-hmm.
she was lying on the street with flies buzzing over her, and
Right.
nobody had taken responsibility. The police would just walk by, the clients would walk by, people would walk by, vendors would walk by. So she had to take one of those vegetable carts, place the body on top of her, on top
Mm-hmm.
of that, and then take her to the uh, cremation ground. And I think that what is interesting here is to see how notions of dignity that are so that are, I think, the most talked about when it comes to sex work, and that work needs to have dignity and so on and so forth. But the notion of dignity also collapses once your body becomes your home, because there is a sense of dignity that one attaches to having a secure household
Mm-hmm.
and a secure place to live in that supports
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah.
So the materiality of where you live is also closely related to something as, uh, something as, how do I put it? But something like dignity in the first place, and then also to work, because
Right.
they're very closely related categories. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that is what, again, these are the arguments that are also used by scholars who talk about affordable housing and what housing does.
Yeah.
And that's how I'm trying to make these connections. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's interesting to think about that. That you not only do you lose your source of income, the work you do, but you also lose the safety of simply existing, because in case the brothel is not a secure place anymore, in case it gets raided by the police, or in case you contact a disease, you are at the same time losing your place of work or the work you do, along with like the place you reside in. I
Yeah,
think, yeah, I think that's worth thinking about. Anyway, thank you so much. Like, I don't know, I really enjoyed reading the paper and listening to you. It gave me a lot to think about, and I would be happy to discuss if you want to later as well.
of
Thank you
course.
so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Swapnil, for your kind of interventions, and also to our speaker for responding with correctly. So now I open the forum for questions. If anyone has questions, they can raise their hand. And there is one question in comment box. I think Jigyasa, the up you can ask it directly if you want, or otherwise I could read from the chat box.
I don't think I'm in the
Yeah.
best zone
So,
for being able to say it out loud. So that's why I've done.
oh, okay, okay. So So I will read your question from the comment section. So she says, yeah, obviously it's a very insightful session. So many congratulations on the thick fieldwork you are doing. Not all research is equal, and the amount of emotions and academic labor that goes into building and understanding in difficult fields, which this would be, is commendable. What particularly stood out for me as a non-monolithic currents within the moral universe, particularly the distinctive perspective on ethnic identities. A spatial peppering of sex workers and sex work was also very interesting, as this new way where a space and sex workers cannot no longer be congruent. My question is, do you think in the way that Kamatipura has assumed a character name, the decoupling of a space and sex workers' body would create a possibility of de-stigmatizations of both sex work and sex workers' body? Yeah, that
I
was the
think,
question.
first of all, thank you for all the kind words. Uh, it was, I won't lie, it was difficult to do field work because first of all, some of these stories, like I said, are really they're really scary. So while on the field also, my folks were always worried, where are you, come back home, are you with a friend? So that is always there. So difficult field, but I think it's important to go to difficult fields, especially if you're from a privileged caste or class position, because it's important to break out of your own bubble. But I think the destigmatization of sex working bodies is, of course, space and sex working body. I exclusively talk about space and sex working bodies, but destigmatization of sex working bodies is a really difficult challenge. And that is because there are notions of morality and of character and of goodness and properness. And I use ness specifically because it's the essence of what we're talking about, right? And about all of these that we've attached to bodies that are intimate. And I didn't talk about this because I thought it would be very tangential, because one of the things that I also explored on the field was the notion of intimacy and love. So, whose body is capable of speaking with love? Because even for a sex working body, even something like love becomes a stigma, a challenge. And I think what's interesting is that, be it the performance of intimacy or be it, leaving Kamatipura, doing something else, the destigmatization of sex working bodies is a cultural, is a social challenge, and it's not just a spatial challenge. So, of course, decoupling of space and sex working bodies, there is something, uh, you know, there is something to be said about that. But there is a lot more work that needs to be put in destigmatization of sex working bodies in its entirety. And I'm seeing one more question here from Swapnil. I hope that answers your question at least to some extent, Jigyasa. It's a very difficult question, I must say, because the stigma and what we think of sex working bodies, what we think of bodies that have sex in general, even if they are not sex working bodies, is such a it's such an I mean it's really definitive in the way that we think about it. So I think it's difficult to approach this question in that sort of way. And like Swapnil is saying, most of the sex workers that I spoke with, and the sex workers that I spoke about here, and the respondents spoke about there on field, were women. That's because there's something happened in the 90s in Kamatipura and in Falkland Road, where there used to be a lot of transgender sex workers, and then I think one of them, was part of a theft or some sort of dacoity, and then they were tomatoes were thrown at them, and they were all kicked out of Kamatipura, and all of that happened. And which is why I specifically talk about the woman and the woman's body and the Hindutva morality that comes attached to the woman's body as a national body and so forth. So, sex workers who are male and transgender are in fact very difficult to find in Kamatipura and in Falkland Road. But if you go out to other places in the city, and there used to be this point where my friends would call me and tell me, hey, I saw a sex worker, do you want to speak to them? But because my work is very place-based here, where I'm only looking at Kamatipura and Falkland Road, I didn't have the chance to speak to sex workers who are men or who are trans. So that, and there is also, what I've understood on the field is that the clients who go to a woman who is a sex worker, there is a hierarchy to clients as well. So, a client who is better off financially, or is of a specific caste position that is privileged, will usually go to a woman. And clients of subaltern castes, clients of subaltern positions in society, will again usually go to transgender sex workers. This is what my respondents told me, because again they look down upon sex workers who are not women. So there is a hierarchy in clientele, and there is a hierarchy in sex working in itself. So again, so that is what we need to think about when we think about trans sex workers, when we think about men who are in sex work. Yeah, of course. I mean, if Girija is here, they have done such incredible work, and she was part of the Kamatipura Kala Mela. And the work that I mean, and I also fortunately found many. I met so many sex workers who were part of my own study when I was doing this, and this is, I mean, the work that they've done is really brilliant. I really urge for all of you who are not familiar with Kamatipura Kala Mela, please go to the Ha Hum Instagram page and please look at the work that they've done. There was a theater show that was put up. There was a play, and there was some beautiful art and sculpture, and it was just magnificent. So if you're not familiar, please do go see the kind of work that is happening in Kamatipura, and that all sort of the stigma that we attach to the place, and people who don't go to Kamatipura have this notion of risk, right? When we go to places such as Kamatipura or Falkland Road, and these notions of risk also need to be challenged. And the way that it's being challenged by work that is being done by, say, Kamatipura Kalamala has been incredible. So please, I urge everyone to please go to their Instagram channel and support them as much as you can. They've been doing great work.
Is there anyone who is willing, who is intent to ask? Yeah. Any question further?
Hi, Sara.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yes,
so
please.
much for the shout out. I joined in late, but I'm really interested in your research and let's connect. And please, yeah, thank you for visiting and all of you. The equality and autonomy with which sex workers have done our Mela is very commendable, and we are so proud to be part of their team. Thank you, Sara, for the shout out.
Thank you for attending.
Any questions? Oh,
I think it was pretty
yeah.
pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it's a very, rich with lots of field work details, stories. So, shall we conclude it now if there is no question?
Yeah, we should do that.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you, Dr. Sara, for giving your valuable time and your fieldwork details, your study on this very important topic. So we are very thankful to you for accepting our invitation and joining us and sharing your knowledge or your perspective. So thank you so much. And also, we'd like to thank our discussant, Swapnil, for kind of good interventions, so raising important questions. So thank you. And we also like to really appreciate our attendees, those who join us to hear on this topic. So thank you so much. With this, we like to end it. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day. It's already evening, but rest of the time, yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. I think there is question, maybe I don't know, in the chat box.
I think they're comments.
Okay, comments, yeah. So yeah, thank you, everyone, and I hope, yeah, bye.
Thank you for being patient and listening to me. Thank you for everyone who came.
Not at all. I stay in touch with you about your scholarship.
I would love to do that.
Yeah, Salvi, and yeah, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you.